August 1988. 9-year-old Delphine Boulet went with her brother Nicolas to a scout camp near Deauville, France. Nicolas had spent 2 consecutive summers at this secluded camp, set in a picturesque location, and had always had a wonderful time. This time, his younger sister joined him, but the last week of the summer holidays, which was supposed to be filled with joy and laughter, turned into a nightmare. One night, while she was supposed to be sleeping peacefully in her tent, Delphine vanished without a trace. The camp proved to be far less safe than the children's parents had believed, and if not for a twist of fate, the nice guy with a gloomy look, as the kidnapper was described by his friends, would never have been caught, and the case would never have been solved. The Boulet family had always lived in the Paris region, in Issy-les-Moulineaux. Alain and Marie-Josée Boulet were raising 2 wonderful children, a son, Nicolas Boulet, and his younger sister, Delphine. Nicolas had been spending his summer holidays at a scout camp for 2 years in a row. In 1988, his younger sister, 9-year-old Delphine, went with him for the first time. The trip took place in August, during the last week of the holidays before the start of the new school year. Wanting to please their daughter, her parents decided to let her spend a week in nature at the camp. Like many parents, Alain and Marie-Josée felt a sense of anxiety about sending their children away for so long, but they were confident that the camp provided reliable supervision. However, they soon realized that this was not the case. Early on the morning of Saturday, August 27, 1988, the telephone rang in the Boulet family home. Alain answered the call. It was the director of the camp where his children were staying. He said, "Delphine is no longer at the camp." He repeated the phrase 2 or 3 times, but the father did not understand. The words simply would not register. It was a thought he refused to believe. What did it mean that his daughter was no longer at the camp? Where was she? When the director finally managed to make Alain understand that they could not find the girl, he immediately decided that he had to go there at once. The scout camp was located in Villerville, a small village a few kilometers from Deauville, right on the seashore. The village is famous for being one of the filming locations of the movie Monkey in Winter, based on the novel by Antoine Blondin and starring Jean Gabin and Jean-Paul Belmondo. Those familiar with this classic of French cinema will remember the scene in which the 2 protagonists end up behind the counter of the restaurant Le Cabaret Normand, located precisely in Villerville. The scout camp itself was set in the countryside, on elevated ground offering a magnificent view of the coastline. It consisted of 3 tents accommodating 20 to 25 children. Among them were only 2 girls, Delphine and her 10-year-old tentmate, Marlene. When Marlene woke up on Saturday morning, August 27th, she was surprised to find that Delphine was no longer there. She hurried to inform the camp leaders. The staff searched for Delphine, but since the tents were essentially in the middle of nowhere, there were no nearby places the girl could have gone on her own. They quickly realized they would not be able to find her by themselves. The child's disappearance was reported to her parents, and the emergency services were contacted. A large-scale search operation was launched. More than 200 gendarmes searched for Delphine, joined by firefighters and volunteers. They combed an area of several square kilometers. Helicopters, divers, and canine units were brought in. Not a single ditch, grove, field, or meadow was left unchecked. At that point, everyone believed that Delphine had left the camp on her own. Several facts seemed to support this theory. First, she had left wearing her shoes and had taken a flashlight with her. Second, the day before her disappearance, a small incident had occurred. Delphine had lost her scout patrol flag. She might have lost it near the old aquarium in the village of Trouville-sur-Mer, which the children had visited. The police therefore assumed that the girl might have gone there to look for it. Of course, this version was investigated, but it led nowhere. But even if the girl had decided to go somewhere on her own, that did not change the fact that such an undertaking was extremely dangerous for a child. This part of Normandy is very marshy and wooded, with largely sparsely populated areas. Not only was the terrain itself hazardous, but the girl could also have encountered wild animals or died from hunger or thirst. On the other hand, there were many farms and barns in the area where she might have found shelter, and as a scout she could, in theory, survive and even feed herself for several days. On one of the farms, an abandoned apple core was found, and for some reason, it was assumed that Delphine had left it there. As a result, after 3 days of searching, the police were convinced that the girl had left the camp on her own for some reason and was now afraid to return, fearing punishment. Delphine's parents could not sit idly by. Every day they rose at dawn and went to bed late in order to take part in the search for their daughter, putting up flyers asking anyone who might have seen her to come forward. Alain, the girl's father, told journalists that his daughter was quite strong and resilient for her age, loved walking, and could already have gone several kilometers. However, he did not truly believe that she could have run away. Like many children, she was shy, and running away from home did not fit her character at all. Delphine grew up in a very close-knit and loving family. She was close to her brother Nicolas. Delphine was a bright girl and a good student with many interests, particularly dancing. There were no problems at home or at school, and she had no reason to run away. Nevertheless, Alain did not rule out any theory that might explain his daughter's disappearance. He took a loudspeaker and began driving around the area. "Delphine, it's Daddy. Come out. You won't be punished. I'm begging you, my darling. Show yourself to your father," he repeated again and again. He drove for hours on end, pleading with his daughter to stop hiding. He clung to the hope that she had simply run away and was afraid to return, fearing she would be scolded. Because if it was not a runaway, then Delphine's fate could be far more terrible, and that was a thought he could not bear to entertain. But the more time passed, the more both the parents and the police began to consider that this might not be a runaway at all. The prosecutor opened a criminal investigation. On September 6th, about 20 kilometers from Villerville, a man who was picking mushrooms came across a partially charred body. The police who arrived at the scene confirmed that it was the body of a girl. It was in a horrific condition. It was clear that a flammable liquid had been poured over it to intensify the fire. Officers also found a rope that had been used to bind the victim. The girl had been struck several times with the back of her head against the rocky ground, and there were signs of asphyxiation. However, she had not been strangled by hands or a rope. It was more likely that the perpetrator had forced some kind of gag into her mouth. Because parents usually keep their child's first baby teeth after they fall out, one such tooth was compared with the burned body. Thanks to this milk tooth, the victim was identified as Delphine Boulet. Since she had first been struck on the head against the ground, investigators hoped that she was already dead when her body was set on fire and did not feel it. The experience of investigators in cases like this immediately suggested that they were dealing with a sexual assault followed by murder and an attempt to cover up the crime by setting a fire. Clearly, the case took a completely new turn, and after the discovery of the girl's body, the police began searching for her killer. Naturally, suspicion immediately fell on the camp staff. There were 5 of them in total, including the camp director. They behaved with dignity, understanding that the police were simply doing their job. Of course, they maintained their innocence and were soon released, as there was no evidence suggesting their involvement. Time passed, and the police had no new suspects. They questioned around 3,500 people, hoping that residents of the region might know something. They also examined the possible involvement of individuals who had previously been investigated or convicted in cases involving attacks on children. Unfortunately, it was a complete failure. The investigation did not move forward at all. The police feared that if the girl had been attacked by someone unknown to the family and with no prior record, finding him would be possible only by sheer luck. Incredibly, it was precisely such a stroke of luck that helped solve the case. Autumn 1990 arrived. A restaurateur from Deauville, Remy Boivin, accidentally discovered a briefcase in an apartment he had provided for one of his employees. Inside were newspaper clippings about the tragedy that had occurred at the camp, many clippings. But most importantly, there was more than just that. In the briefcase lay a letter confessing to the murder of Delphine. The letter was addressed to the girl's mother, although she had, of course, never received such a message. The author wrote that he was driven towards sexual violence and the murder of girls. He said he had seen Delphine in town and that she had caught his attention. He wrote, "She will be mine in 4 days. Later you will find her body. It will be cold, and the body will be completely naked. She will be assaulted and strangled. That is all. I wanted to warn you." The letter had been written by Remy's employee, a dishwasher at his restaurant, 29-year-old Gerard Lebourg. Gerard was immediately taken into custody. He did not resist. The man recounted in detail the murder of Delphine and the assault on her. Gerard explained that he had stumbled upon the children's camp completely by chance during a walk, and in his mind a plan for the crime immediately took shape. He bought gasoline at a Deauville gas station and stocked up on ropes, cotton for a gag, and sheets. Then, on August 26th, he hid in a cornfield where he spent part of the night, showing remarkable patience. Eventually, he heard the characteristic sound of a tent zipper opening. He then spotted the child walking with a flashlight toward a nearby tree. Clearly, the girl had gone there to attend to a natural need. Leaving the cornfield, Gerard followed the girl, grabbed her from behind, gagged her with cotton, wrapped her in a sheet, placed her in his car, and drove to the edge of a small forest. It was there that he pulled Delphine from the car. Gerard tied the victim with ropes, assaulted her, and then struck the back of her head against the ground several times with force. He poured gasoline over the lifeless body, threw the can itself on top, and set it on fire, without bothering to remove the ropes that had bound her. He then fled the crime scene. It was a very detailed account. The detectives had no doubt that Gerard was telling the truth, as he knew specific details that the police had not shared with the press. Gerard Laborde had never come to the attention of the police, although investigators later established that this was not because he had lived a blameless life. For years, his relatives noticed alarming behavior that pointed to severe psychological disturbances. These warning signs were known within the family, but no decisive action was taken. In 1984, 4 years before the events at the scout camp, Gerard was involved in a serious incident within his own family while alone with a young relative. The incident was concealed and no report was ever made to the authorities. Silence prevailed and responsibility was avoided. To her credit, Gerard's mother did not attempt to deny the severity of the situation. She insisted that her son be admitted to a psychiatric hospital where he underwent treatment. However, the intervention failed to prevent further harm. After his release, another grave incident occurred, once again involving a family member, and once again it remained hidden. Under different circumstances, these events should have led to legal consequences long before Delphine Boulet's disappearance. Instead, Gerard remained invisible to the justice system. Part of the reason lay in the environment he came from, a profoundly dysfunctional household marked by neglect, violence, and silence. There were 9 children in the family. The parents failed to provide safety, stability, or protection. One of the children later took her own life, and the family eventually disintegrated. Accountability was absent and suffering went unaddressed. By the age of 29, Gerard lived in isolation, unable to form normal relationships. At work, he appeared quiet and unremarkable. Colleagues described him as polite, reserved, and distant, someone who easily faded into the background. What no one saw was the inner world he carried with him. Over time, his thoughts grew darker, increasingly focused on domination and destruction. These obsessions were never confronted, never treated, and never stopped. When Delphine Boulet crossed his path, the trajectory that had been forming for years reached its tragic conclusion. On January 23, 1991, the police and the prosecutor's office conducted a reconstruction of the crime. Gerard agreed to take part in it. To make everything as accurate as possible, everyone approached the tree where Delphine had been killed, deep at night. The weather was very cold, but Gerard obediently and in detail showed how the crime had occurred. He acted out the scene of sexual assault. Then he set fire to a mannequin representing the victim. It was so realistic and horrifying that one of the gendarmes, who had served many years in the police, could not hide his tears. The trial began in May 1992. Gerard was tried both for the murder of Delphine and for what he had done to his niece and cousin. Despite his confession and participation in the crime reconstruction, Gerard declared that he was innocent. Throughout the trial, he kept his head down and did not look up. Even when Delphine's father, Alain Boulet, spoke, he stood up and, with incredible dignity and without shedding a single tear, spoke about his little daughter. He began with the words, "I dreamed of inviting Delphine to dance with me on her 18th birthday." His testimony made a powerful impression on the jurors. Equally compelling were the pieces of evidence against Gerard, including his letter, confession, and the reconstruction of the crime. There was no doubt about his guilt. The prosecutor demanded a life sentence for the defendant, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. He added that 15 years earlier, he would have demanded the death penalty. The request was granted. This sentence is considered the maximum penalty in France. Gérard showed no reaction to the verdict. He was sent to prison, where he died at the age of 44. In Issy-les-Moulineaux, where the Boulay family lives, a garden was created in the name of Little Delphine. It was opened 15 years ago on September 26, 2010. At the entrance, a photograph of the little girl was installed. It shows her smiling, as she always did, before a man came into her life and took away her chance to grow up and live the life she might have chosen. Delphine's parents joined other families of missing and murdered children to create the Association of Parents of Victimized Children. This organization still exists today and supports more than 250 families across the country. But most importantly, it initiated the creation of a genetic database to track sexual offenders in France. This is one of the most harrowing French criminal cases. In April 2004, 10-year-old Jonathan Coulombe was abducted from his bed at a holiday camp in Loire-Atlantique, even though 5 other boys were sleeping nearby and the group was accompanied by numerous supervisors. Although his body was discovered 6 weeks later and the police had a suspect from the very beginning, for many years the investigation stalled without a single lead in what was clearly a sexually motivated crime. However, after 14 years of fruitless searching, an unexpected witness turned the case upside down. The police uncovered a dangerous predator who hunted where he could easily seize his prey, an experienced killer who forced investigators to look for answers beyond the country's borders. In 2004, Jonathan was 10 years old. He lived in the town of Orval in the Cher department with his mother Virginie, his stepfather Stéphane, and his 3 younger sisters. The family lived quite modestly. Virginie worked as a cashier. Stéphane had been a cable installer until an accident in 2001 when he broke his spine. Jonathan's biological father did not take part in his son's life, and when Virginie married Stéphane, the boy was only a year and a half old. At home, his nicknames were Titi, Joe, and Cowboy. The last one was his favorite, and he wore a cowboy hat as often as he could to live up to it. Jonathan was a blond boy with blue eyes, rather slight in build, about 140 centimeters tall and weighing around 30 kilograms. Those close to him described him as shy, but cheerful and full of life. He liked football and motorcycles. His interests were essentially no different from those of any other boy his age. In the spring of 2004, Jonathan's teacher suggested sending the children to a holiday camp that was frequently used by school groups. He wanted to take the class on a seaside trip to Loire-Atlantique, specifically to the town of Saint-Brevin-les-Pins. The trip was planned to last a week, and Jonathan would be traveling with 24 other pupils, as well as a driver, teachers, and activity leaders. In other words, the children would be under close supervision. Despite this, Virginie was initially reluctant to let Jonathan go. First, she did not want to be separated from her young son, whom she perhaps overprotected. Second, the trip posed financial difficulties for the family. Jonathan was aware of this and understood the situation, so he explained it to his teacher. The teacher spoke with Virginie and promised to help the family obtain financial assistance to cover the cost of the trip. While his mother was still hesitating, Jonathan said to her, "Mom, do you realize that I might be the only one who doesn't go?" This simply phrased question tipped the scales in his favor. The family tightened their budget but managed to prepare the boy for the trip. Thus, Jonathan was given the chance to see the sea for the first time in his life. The children were accommodated at a holiday camp in the southern part of the town of Saint-Brevin-les-Pins. It was a fairly quiet place, especially in April, when about half of the houses in the town stood empty. The camp building belonged to a state teacher training college, and there are many similar facilities across France. Jonathan was placed in a room with 5 other boys. The room had no door handle, so it could never be closed, ensuring that if a child was inside, he could always get out. Jonathan's bed was the first one by the entrance. The boy truly enjoyed his stay. The sea, the excursions to the harbor. He called his mother to tell her that he was having a wonderful time and that everything was great. Virginie was happy to hear that he was enjoying himself, not feeling homesick, and not eager to come back home. On April 6th, the children's stay was coming to an end, and the older kids organized a party for everyone. It was supposed to last until 2 o'clock in the morning, but children Jonathan's age left earlier. That evening brought Jonathan a small disappointment. He asked a girl he liked to dance, but she refused. Normally, this would have been nothing serious, but his friends started teasing him about it, and he was, of course, very upset. Overall, however, the evening passed without incident, and by around 11:30 p.m., Jonathan and the 5 boys who shared his room had gone to bed at midnight. One of the adults accompanying the children checked the rooms and saw that Jonathan was sleeping peacefully. A little later, the bus driver who had been transporting the children on the trip and who was sleeping in the same building got up to use the bathroom. She noticed that the door to the wing where Jonathan's room and the other boys' room were located was open. She assumed that the wind had blown it open or that one of the teachers had failed to lock it properly. She closed the door and went back to her room to sleep. She did not check whether all the children were present. It never occurred to her that she should do so. It was cold and raining outside, and in any case, this was not part of her duties. Moreover, such an action would have seemed odd under the circumstances, and this is the moment that haunts people for years. Not because anyone was cruel, because it felt normal. An open door at night, wind, a mistake, nothing to panic about. So it gets closed, and everyone goes back to sleep. But in true crime, this is how evil moves. Quietly, through the gap nobody thinks is dangerous. And by morning, that small detail becomes the last clean line between safety and a nightmare. But the woman now bitterly reproaches herself for having done nothing because, in the morning, it turned out that a child was missing. The 5 boys who shared Jonathan's room woke up around 7 o'clock, and Jonathan's bed was empty. The adults accompanying the group could not find him either in the building or outside. The boys' belongings were still in place. It was clear that he could not have gone far, since he was wearing only his pajamas without even slippers. At first, people were quick to blame Jonathan's friends, assuming that they had hurt him with their teasing, causing him to run away, perhaps to teach them a lesson. But it soon became obvious that this was not the case. It was not like Jonathan. He was not a reckless little boy who would leave in nothing but his pajamas, barefoot in cold, rainy, and windy weather. Anxiety grew rapidly. The runaway hypothesis lasted only a few hours, especially since Jonathan's parents had given him very clear instructions. If you want to come home, just call us and we'll come right away. The police officers who arrived at the scene favored the theory of an abduction. Since children are often abducted by relatives, and the boy had a biological father, suspicions initially fell on him. However, the man had an alibi. He was nowhere near the site of the disappearance and was in the Paris area at the time. This meant that, as hard as it was to believe, the boy had been abducted by a stranger. It would have taken remarkable cold-bloodedness to come and kidnap a child from such a place. Most likely, the abductor chose the first boy he came across, because Jonathan's bed was the closest to the door. It sounds horrifying, but he was the easiest target. Jonathan's roommates were, of course, questioned carefully. One of them thought he might have heard a car during the night, but was not sure it hadn't been a dream. Another recalled seeing the light of a flashlight at night and hearing a male voice asking, "Are you asleep?" A team of officers was assembled to search for the boy, and the search area was vast. The holiday camp was located near a wooded area that led to a highway. The fence separating the camp from the road was not locked and in some places was badly damaged. Although the area was generally quiet and no such crimes had ever occurred there before, the security of the camp left much to be desired. Any outsider could enter and leave freely. Unfortunately, this became clear too late. Since it was April, most of the 2,000 to 2,500 houses in the area were unoccupied, meaning the perpetrator could have been hiding in one of them. Someone might even have seen a stranger. The police combed the area around the camp, tirelessly searching for the boy, but without success. Appeals to potential witnesses for any information went unanswered. A week passed, and the chances of finding Jonathan alive grew ever smaller. On April 22, 2004, the French police were contacted by their German counterparts, who reported that Jonathan's abduction shared many similarities with cases in Germany. They were searching for a serial killer nicknamed the Man in Black. He was suspected of at least 40 attacks on boys in summer camps or in tents by the sea. 4 other boys had been abducted and murdered. French investigators took this lead very seriously, especially since one witness claimed to have seen a car with German license plates parked near the holiday camp on the night of the disappearance. However, no trace of this serial killer was found in either France or Germany. The investigation reached a dead end. 6 weeks after Jonathan's abduction, residents of the town of Guérande, about 25 kilometers from Saint-Brevin-le-Pin, contacted the police. For several days, they had been noticing a strange object floating in a local pond. On the evening of May 19th, the police made a horrifying discovery. The strange object in the pond turned out to be the body of a child, naked, bound in a fetal position, with a heavy cinder block tied to it with a rope. His neck, ankles, and wrists were bound with nylon cord using a maritime knot. It was Jonathan. The autopsy showed that the child had not drowned. There were no wounds or signs of strangulation. The pathologist concluded that the boy had suffocated when the killer cut off his access to oxygen. In other words, covered his mouth and nose, preventing him from breathing. The body was too badly decomposed to determine with certainty whether Jonathan had been sexually assaulted. However, the forensic expert concluded that death had occurred shortly before the body was discovered. This suggested that the perpetrator was either a local resident or had been able to stay at the home of someone local during the weeks in which he allegedly kept his victim alive. Unexpectedly, investigators discovered that they had the suspect's DNA. Forensic technicians found a tiny blood stain on the pillowcase of the pillow Jonathan had slept on. Analysis showed that the DNA was male, but it did not belong to Jonathan. A large-scale DNA collection and testing campaign was launched. Police compiled a list of individuals who had ever been detained in connection with violent offenses and took samples from more than 200 men, but without success. The investigation once again stalled. 4 years later, a new team of investigators was formed to re-examine the case from the very beginning. Their findings would call into question all the work that had been done previously, as well as the conclusions of their predecessors. First of all, it emerged that the DNA on which earlier investigators had pinned so much hope had only misled the investigation. It belonged to another young boy who had stayed at the holiday camp before Jonathan. In essence, the staff had failed to properly wash the bed linen used by the children. The investigators were deeply frustrated because that DNA had been their only hope of linking the crime to a suspect if he were ever identified. It had been a waste of time, money, and effort. But that was not all. A review of the autopsy report revealed that Jonathan had died just a few hours after the abduction, not shortly before his body was found in the pond. This cast doubt on the theory that the perpetrator had lived in the town or a nearby village during that entire period. In fact, he could have left immediately after the murder without staying long at all. It was at this point that the trail of the German serial killer, known as the Man in Black, resurfaced. Officers checked all German workers who had been in France at the time of the crime. For example, those involved in building the cruise ship Queen Mary II, working at the Gare Saint-Lazare, or at the aircraft manufacturer Airbus. In an effort to renew public attention and restart the investigation, in 2008, the police created a website dedicated to the case and issued several appeals to witnesses in Germany. Efforts in France led nowhere, but their German colleagues made much more progress in tracking the elusive Man in Black. In Hamburg, a man named Martin Ney was arrested. The German police had first questioned him in 2007 regarding attacks on children, but due to lack of evidence, he was not charged. Several years later, he was arrested again, and this time he confessed to his crimes. Ney admitted to dozens of cases of abuse and the murders of 3 boys. He denied involvement in the killing of a 4th boy from the Netherlands, who had also been linked to the Man in Black, and it was later confirmed that he was indeed not responsible for that crime. Born in 1970, Martin Ney had worked as an animator, teacher, and chaperone for children at camps and holiday centers, giving him intimate knowledge of how they operated. At age 24, he attempted to become a foster parent. Although he was a young single student, clearly not an ideal candidate, the German authorities approved his application due to a shortage of foster parents at the time. He was entrusted with a 12-year-old boy who lived with him until adulthood, and Ney never harmed him. Ney hunted where he could take his time choosing a victim. Completely ordinary by day, he became a monster at night, Although he was not working at the holiday camp in Saint-Brevin-le-Pin at the time of Jonathan's abduction, he knew the layout of the rooms there down to the smallest detail. This gave him the ability to drive a few kilometers, enter the building unobstructed, abduct his victim, and disappear just as silently. In 2011, Martin Ney was questioned regarding Jonathan's murder. While his confession in Germany had been more a gesture of goodwill on his part, he had no intention of cooperating with the French police. He vehemently denied any involvement. He also seemed to have a sort of alibi. Ney's bank card had been used in Germany on April 7, 2004, more than 800 kilometers from the crime scene. Of course, it was possible that someone else had used the card. As a suspect, Martin Ney seemed highly convincing. His handwriting matched exactly the handwriting of Jonathan's killer. Nevertheless, without concrete evidence, witnesses, or a confession, the case once again fell to the background. Nearly 14 years had passed since Jonathan's murder. During all that time, his family had lived in a nightmare, yet the investigators never gave up. The breakthrough in the case came in 2018, when a prisoner serving time in the same jail and cell as the Man in Black came forward with crucial information about Jonathan's case. The man explained that he had befriended his cellmate, Martin Ney, and that Ney had confided in him. Martin admitted to the abduction and murder of the boy in France. Of course, prisoner testimonies are often, to put it mildly, unreliable, but this time investigators believed him because he knew details about Jonathan's abduction and murder that had never been made public. These facts were known only to the investigators and the examining judge, and some things were not even known to them. For example, Martin told his cellmate that in the chaos, he had lost a leather backpack in France containing his documents. He was also astonished that he had not been arrested earlier, since a witness, a man walking his dog, had seen him dispose of the victim's body. Indeed, the case files include the testimony of a retired farmer who witnessed a strange scene on April 9, 2004. He saw a car parked at the edge of the pond, the very same pond where Jonathan's body would later be found. The trunk of the car was open and facing the water. The license plates were German, and most interestingly, the farmer had been walking his dog that day. Overall, the prisoner's testimony sounded highly credible and was supported by a number of verified facts. Consequently, the French police threw all their resources into finding that brown leather backpack. They appealed to the public for witnesses who might have found it years earlier, but the effort yielded nothing. On October 9, 2019, France went all in and requested the extradition of the man. In January 2021, Martin Ney was transferred from Germany so that he could attend the hearing in Jonathan's case. On January 25th, he was formally charged with murder. This kicked off a race against time. Under an agreement between Germany and France, France had 8 months to convict the accused. If successful, Martin Ney faced life imprisonment for the abduction of a minor under 15, with resulting death. The police again appealed to the public for help, urging witnesses who might have seen Ney, found the backpack, or perhaps rented him a room to come forward. But after 8 months, on September 22, 2021, the inevitable happened. Martin returned to his prison cell in Germany. The triumph of justice in Jonathan's case thus remained only a hope. Everyone, the children who shared the holiday camp with him, their teachers, parents, and the police, waits to one day know what truly happened that night in April 2004 and who killed Jonathan. Although the police are almost certain who did it, for the boy's family, especially his mother, it is crucial that a trial take place. Whether Martin Ney is truly guilty or not, Virginie wants to face her son's killer, to have him answer the questions that have tormented her for so many years. Why did he choose her son? What did he do to him? How did he die? No matter how painful it will be to hear the answers, Virginie believes nothing could be worse than the years of nightmare she and her family have lived through. Until the true perpetrator is brought to justice, these questions will never disappear. This is what makes the Jonathan Coulomb case so brutal. It can feel solved and still remain unresolved. A name, a pattern, a predator who knew exactly how camps worked. And yet, without a trial, the family is left with the same unanswered questions, year after year, because it's not only what happened that night, it's how easily it can happen and how long the truth can stay out of reach. Sometimes darkness doesn't hide in alleyways. It hides within the people we trust the most. In Andalusia, an ordinary day turned to a mystery. Someone set out on a short walk and never arrived. But no one suspected that evil was already close and smiling. On February 28, 2018, the people of Spain were celebrating Andalusia Day as usual, and students were enjoying their extra time off. One of those happy school children was 8-year-old Gabriel Cruz. To keep him from getting bored, the boy's father, Angel Cruz, decided to make his son happy and take him to visit his grandmother. Angel was divorced from Gabriel's mother, Patricia, but the former spouses maintained a very warm relationship for the sake of their child, so the mother easily agreed to let her son go to his grandmother's house. Angel took the boy to his own mother. The morning of February 27, 2018, the boy spent playing with his cousins, who lived near his grandmother. Around 1 o'clock, Gabriel returned to his grandmother's house for lunch, after which he asked again to be allowed to go back to the girls because he wanted to play a little longer. At first, his grandmother refused, saying he needed a short nap, but he kept persuading her, and she agreed. She looked out the window and watched him run toward the girls. In reality, only 2 houses, literally about 100 meters apart in a straight line, separated them. For Gabriel, it was normal to run back and forth because the girls really were close by. The grandmother saw the child disappear around the corner, which meant he had reached his destination. It was a completely safe neighborhood. All the neighbors knew each other and were friendly, so the woman felt she had nothing to worry about. The boy left the house around 3:45 p.m., but he never arrived at his relative's house. Since they didn't know Gabriel was coming, it never occurred to them to raise the alarm. The grandmother also believed he was playing with his cousins. The family only realized Gabriel was missing around 6 p.m. when the grandmother expected him for dinner, and he still hadn't returned. Gabriel's grandmother called Patricia and Angel, and the boy's parents decided to contact the police. The investigation began. One hypothesis was that the boy had simply gotten lost, but the parents couldn't believe it because Gabriel knew the area very well, and the route from one house to the other was straight, a path he had taken several times that day. Another theory was that he had been kidnapped by a gang of criminals for ransom. However, Gabriel's parents were ordinary workers and probably couldn't have raised a large sum quickly. With the help of the media, Patricia and Angel appealed to the kidnappers or anyone who might know Gabriel's whereabouts. They described him as a very kind, obedient, and loving child. The parents had given him the affectionate nickname Little Fish because he adored the sea and already dreamed of becoming a marine biologist at such a young age. They cried and begged anyone with information about the boy to help them, offering a reward of 10,000 euros, which friends, colleagues, and neighbors were raising for the family. Volunteers distributed flyers, noting that the boy was wearing black pants, a white t-shirt, and a red hoodie. At the same time, search teams were formed. The search, during which the police checked every corner within a 6 kilometers radius, later extending to 12 kilometers, continued for several days. Helicopters, sniffer dogs, and volunteers were all involved in the effort to find Gabriel. Among the searchers was Angel's girlfriend, Ana Julia Quezada. She was the one who made a crucial discovery in the case. Together with Angel, she was searching for Gabriel when, in the bushes 3.5 kilometers from the boy's grandmother's house, she found a white t-shirt. The t-shirt was lying near the Nijar water treatment plant. Anna recognized Gabriel's t-shirt because she had helped him get dressed that day. Laboratory tests confirmed that the t-shirt had the boy's DNA. It was indeed his. But where were the rest of his clothes and Gabriel himself? Meanwhile, all the attention of journalists and the public was focused on a 42-year-old man named Diego Ife, who suddenly became the police's main suspect. The man was very attracted to Patricia, Gabriel's mother. At first, she returned his feelings, but only until his attention became excessive and obsessive. He was obsessed with Patricia, constantly calling her, showing up at her workplace, and, worst of all, coming to Gabriel's school to intercept her. Moreover, Diego suffered from psychological disorders, and Patricia had to turn to the authorities to obtain a restraining order against him. Even that didn't stop him. He was then arrested, and upon release, an ankle bracelet was placed on him to monitor his movements. Diego fit the profile of someone who could seek revenge. He knew the child, knew his mother, could blackmail Patricia, and was unstable enough to commit such an act. On top of that, he removed the bracelet and continued calling Patricia. He was detained for violating his release conditions, and his house and car were searched. In short, everything indicated that the police were firmly focused on Diego at first glance, but in reality, things were not quite that simple. In reality, investigators quickly dismissed the idea that Diego could be the kidnapper. First of all, he lived in a town 40 kilometers from the location where the child disappeared. The police also found 3 witnesses who saw the man on his balcony around 1645. Considering that Gabriel had left his grandmother's house around 1545, there was no way Diego could have kidnapped the boy, hidden him somewhere, and returned. It was completely obvious that he couldn't be in several places at once. For a while, investigators pretended that Diego was their main suspect, but in reality, they quietly monitored Anna's behavior. What mainly concerned them was that the t-shirt Anna found belonged to Gabriel, and it was completely dry. This was suspicious because there had been heavy rain for several days prior. On the day she discovered it in the bushes, it wasn't raining, but the fabric should have shown signs of having been wet for several days. By finding the t-shirt, Anna inadvertently put herself under investigators' scrutiny. The way the t-shirt was found was also strange. Anna claimed that she and Angel found it together, but in fact, she had found it alone when he fell slightly behind. Interestingly, she claimed to have sensed Gabriel's scent and found the t-shirt, even though sniffer dogs had not. Furthermore, she overacted in showing concern for the child. When cameras were pointed at her, she appeared anxious, but at home she was not upset at all. Friends, journalists, and even Angel noticed the oddities in her behavior. Yet Anna continued to shed tears, displaying exaggerated worry. This was despite the fact that her relationship with the boy had been bad. He disliked her attitude and openly told her so. Gabriel was never rude or spoiled, but he spoke the truth to Anna. When asked for her phone, she said she had lost it, and when she found it, nearly everything on it had been deleted. However, this could hardly be considered evidence, so the police tried not to show suspicion in order not to scare Anna away. The woman was placed under constant surveillance. Her phone was tapped, and a tracking device was installed in her car. All that remained was to set a trap so that the suspect would make a mistake and lead them to the child. Investigators contacted Angel and Anna, asking for the key to a remote farm owned by Angel. They said they planned to conduct a search there the next day, just in case. Angel, of course, agreed to give the key and allowed the police to search the farm. Anna naturally did not object either, but early in the morning of March 11, 2018, Anna began to act. She got into a car and drove to the farm. Interestingly, at that moment, she was being watched not only by the police, but also by journalists who found her behavior suspicious. Upon arriving, Anna got out of the car with a blanket. When she returned, it was clear that something was wrapped inside the blanket. She placed it in the trunk and headed toward the house where she lived with Angel. As she was about to enter the garage, the police stopped her. In the car's trunk, they indeed found Gabriel's body. The arrest was recorded on video by the neighbors. Anna shouted that she didn't understand anything, that she was innocent and had simply taken the car that morning. Of course, at that moment, she still didn't know she had been under constant surveillance. Interestingly, for several days, Gabriel's father, Angel, had known that the police suspected his girlfriend, but he, like Patricia, was asked to remain calm and not show in any way that Anna was the main suspect. This was incredibly brave and surely not easy, considering he had to share a bed with someone capable of killing his son. During her interrogation, the woman confessed to Gabriel's murder, but only partially. She claimed that it had been an accident. She said that she intercepted Gabriel while he was on his way to his cousin's house. She told the boy that she was going to paint something at the farm and offered him to come along, promising they would be quick and return soon. Gabriel got into the car. They arrived at the farm. From this point, her story became increasingly implausible. Anna claimed that the boy grabbed an axe and began shouting that he didn't like her, that he didn't want her to see his father, and that he wanted her to return to the Dominican Republic. At some point, according to Anna, she placed her hand over him and took the axe away. Allegedly, he continued yelling and she just wanted him to be quiet, so she covered his mouth and nose with her hands. She cried and swore it was an accident. This might have been believable if the autopsy hadn't shown that Gabriel was also struck on the head and then strangled for about 45 minutes. He died slowly and painfully, and Anna could have saved him by calling an ambulance. Afterwards, she stripped Gabriel down to his underwear and buried his body in a shallow grave on the farm. She then threw some stones on top, got back in the car, and returned home. On March 5th, she disposed of his belongings in a glass recycling bin in a neighboring area. After falling into the trap set by the police, she rushed to the farm, dug up the body, wrapped it in a blanket, and placed it in the trunk of the car. Because the police had installed several listening devices in her vehicle, they heard her muttering angrily about the child the entire way back. She cried out that they needed the boy and that they would get the boy. It is completely unclear what she intended to do with him when she was arrested, especially since she planned to enter the garage of the house she shared with Angel. Initially, the police suspected that Anna might have had an accomplice because all the family cars, Angel's, Patricia's, Anna's, and other relatives, were searched and no trace of soil or blood was found. However, the child could only have been transported from his grandmother's house to the farm by car. In the end, the police abandoned this version, and charges were filed solely against Anna. As for the motive, there were likely two: money and jealousy. First, she was jealous of Angel's love for his son. The father adored and loved the child very much, and despite the separation, he and Patricia maintained excellent relations. They cared for the boy, and he continued to unite them. When Anna planned another trip to the Dominican Republic, Angel refused because his son was supposed to spend time with him. Clearly, this situation infuriated Anna. Second, there was money. This is partly confirmed by the fact that Anna repeatedly spoke about increasing the reward for information about the child. Furthermore, the daughter of her former lover said that Anna was very calculating and greedy. She had nearly killed her ex-lover while they lived together because she refused to call an ambulance when he fell ill. Anna came to Spain at the age of 21. She settled in Almeria. Anna had worked as a prostitute in the Dominican Republic and met her future ex-husband, a truck driver, who decided to take her out of that life and brought her to Spain. The family was raising their daughter when the couple decided to bring Anna's older daughter, 4-year-old Josefina, to Spain as well. The girl had stayed behind in her home country. Unfortunately, in 1996, her older daughter died under mysterious circumstances. One morning, Anna's husband woke up and went to the children's room to check on the girls. He didn't see Josefina, but he noticed a small table near the window. When he ran closer, he saw the girl lying on the asphalt below. She had fallen from the 7th floor. The police arrived, and in their report, they wrote that they had been unable to question the mother because she was in a state of shock. The case was classified as an accident. Now, after it became known that Anna had killed Gabriel, people began suggesting that she might also be responsible for her daughter's death. But investigating such a case after almost 20 years is practically impossible. Moreover, the earlier case had already been officially ruled an accident. The trial for Gabriel's case took place in 2019. The defense requested 3 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter, but that attempt failed. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. Parole is possible after 25 years, meaning that in 2044 she may be released, but only if she proves she has been rehabilitated. Even if she is freed, she will not be allowed to live in Nijar or come within 500 meters of the boy's parents. She is also required to pay the child's parents 250,000 euros in moral damages and reimburse the state for the costs of the search. So, the perpetrator received the maximum punishment and is now in prison. One would think that Gabriel's family could finally distance themselves from the media and simply remember what a wonderful boy he was. But that was not the case. A huge number of online posts began appearing, inviting people to visit a website to see the body of the deceased Gabriel. Those who clicked the links were shown an image of the boy's face placed onto the brutally mutilated body of another child. There were other ways people tried to gain likes or earn money by exploiting the child's image. This was possible because the law does not protect the identity of a deceased person in the same way it protects the rights and identity of the living. Now, the boy's parents are fighting for the right of relatives of deceased children, whose images are used in such ways, to demand the removal of these photos or even the shutdown of such websites. The killer was punished. But the story didn't end there. The family's scars run deeper than any sentence, and even after Gabriel's death, others tried to profit from his tragedy. Let this be a reminder. Evil never vanishes. It simply waits for another shadow to grow in. On a gray autumn day, a young Parisian girl was, as usual, returning home from school, hoping to drop her heavy backpack and have a snack. But as she approached the apartment building where she lived, she was met by a young woman who started a conversation with her. It didn't take much effort for the woman to persuade the girl to come into her apartment. The schoolgirl probably saw nothing dangerous in it. After all, it was a petite young woman, not an unfamiliar man who might have all sorts of thoughts in his head. Besides, they were neighbors living in the same building. The girl followed her new acquaintance. But as soon as she entered the apartment, the door slammed shut, and a nightmare began, one that is hard to put into words. 12-year-old Lola Daviet disappeared, and she was never seen alive again. It was Friday, October 14th, 2022. Johann and Delphine Daviet were waiting for their daughter, Lola, to return from school. The girl knew that on Fridays the family usually went to their country cottage in the town of Bethune, 3 hours' drive from Paris, so she understood she shouldn't be late. Lola had grown up very obedient and never went anywhere without permission. Her school was only about 200 meters from their home, so she was expected to walk through the door any minute. That's why, when the clock hand passed 4 p.m. and their daughter still hadn't arrived, the parents knew something had happened. Johann and Delphine Daviet not only lived in the building, but also worked there. This meant that Johann had the opportunity to check the security camera footage to see whether his daughter had entered the building. To his astonishment, the girl had arrived 45 minutes earlier, and she wasn't alone. She had entered right after a young woman whom the man did not recognize. The woman made a gesture with her hand, as if inviting Lola to follow her. Judging by the video, the girl seemed somewhat uneasy, and the young woman herself looked uncomfortable too. The parents gave the police a photograph of the unknown woman. Delphine also posted her picture on Facebook, writing that her daughter was missing. She described what the girl had been wearing and added that Lola was last seen in the company of an unfamiliar young woman. Delphine urged anyone who might know something to contact the police or the Daviet family. The post was shared by thousands of concerned citizens. People took to the streets to help search for the girl. The search continued for several hours, until at 11:20 p.m., a homeless man entered the inner courtyard of the building where Lola's family lived. He was possibly looking for a place to sleep or something of the sort. In any case, his attention was drawn to a large plastic suitcase. What he found inside made him immediately run to find a police officer. Inside, the police discovered Lola's lifeless body. A subsequent autopsy showed that the cause of death was asphyxiation. In addition, there was a deep wound on her neck, and her body was covered in bruises and cuts. The attacker had tied her hands and feet, and before placing her in the suitcase, had left one strange final mark. The numbers 1 and 0 were written in red ink on Lola's feet. The last person to see her alive was the young woman captured with her on the surveillance cameras. But who was she? It didn't take long for the police to find her, and when they did, the story that unfolded about Lola's murder made their hair stand on end. Investigators decided to finish watching the footage that Lola's father had started. About an hour and a half after Lola came home, accompanied by the stranger, the same young woman was seen leaving the building. She had changed into different clothes and was carrying a large suitcase and 2 smaller bags with wheels. It was the same type of suitcase in which Lola's body would later be found. It became clear that the mysterious stranger was at the very least involved in what had happened to Lola. Police began interviewing potential witnesses to see if anyone had noticed where the woman went after leaving the building. It turned out she had been unsuccessfully asking passers-by to help her with her bags, as they were heavy, and she struggled to move them on her own. Despite the usual friendliness and helpfulness of Parisians, no one helped her, perhaps because she looked and behaved strangely. Her makeup was smudged and she was muttering to herself. At one point, she went into a cafe and bought a croissant. Meanwhile, the suitcase was left standing right in the middle of the street. Passers-by wondered what might be inside it, because According to several witnesses, it smelled strongly of bleach and had red stains on it. Yet, obviously, no one could have imagined that a human body was inside. One witness, who turned out to be crucial for the investigation, also saw the woman enter the cafe. She approached him and asked if he could give her a ride. The woman offered him money for his help and claimed she needed to deliver organs. The man got scared and refused, but he parked his car a short distance away and kept watching her. The woman seemed upset and kept talking to herself. At around 6:30 p.m., a car pulled up. The driver loaded the suitcase and bags into the trunk and drove off with the strange woman. Because the witness was disturbed by what he saw, he wrote down the car's license plate number and later gave it to the police. The police didn't take long to find the driver of the car, the VTC taxi company chauffeur, Rashid N. He confirmed that he knew the mysterious young woman. Her name was Dabia Benkared. She was 24 years old, and they had dated at some point. Dabia had called him and asked for help with her luggage. He went to her place at her request, without asking many questions. Rashid drove Dabia to his home in Asnières-sur-Seine, a suburb of Paris. There, the woman asked for permission to do some laundry and took a shower. She borrowed some of his clothes while hers were being washed. Around 10 p.m., they went out to grab a bite and returned shortly after, when Dabia was preparing to go home. However, the man stated that he had only just brought her and did not intend to make the whole return trip at that hour. Instead, he called another VTC car for her. When the arriving driver saw that the passenger had heavy suitcases, he hurried to help, but Rashid roughly stopped him and ordered him not to touch the luggage, neither now nor when they reached the destination, essentially letting the passenger handle it herself. The woman got into the car, gave the address, and they set off. When they arrived, she didn't get out of the car but called someone. The conversation was quiet but occasionally tense. Dabia asked for help, but her request was refused. As it later turned out, she was calling her sister, who lived in the same apartment building as Lola's family. Dabia asked her sister to come down, let her into the building, and help carry the suitcase and bags to the apartment. But her sister, clearly aware of who Dabia was, said, "No, I won't help you. I don't want to know what's in those bags. Don't bring them here at all." Not knowing what else to do, Dabia dragged the suitcase and bags into the inner courtyard of the building and simply threw them there. After that, she called a friend and asked to stay the night at his place. Apparently, having gotten rid of the luggage, Dabia completely calmed down, and she and her friend spent a perfectly ordinary evening, laughing and joking as if nothing had happened. Who was this woman, and what dark secret was she hiding? As investigators dug deeper, a disturbing portrait began to emerge, a mind fractured by grief, anger, and madness. But even they couldn't predict the true reason behind her monstrous act. So, just 2 days after the camera captured Lola and Dabia together, Dabia was arrested. The police began trying to learn everything they could about her. She had come to France from Algeria 6 years earlier with her mother and 2 sisters. In 2018, 2 years after the move, the police first heard Dabia's name, not as a suspect but as a victim of domestic violence. Relatives and friends described her as a very religious person, and an ex-boyfriend even said she was obsessed with the church. However, they explained that she changed after her father, who had remained in Algeria, passed away, and then, in 2020, her mother died of cancer. Dabia was unable to cope with these losses. She began talking to herself and became more aggressive and unstable. It was known that her temper and violent outbursts had appeared even before her mother's death. In July 2019, she got into a confrontation with hospital staff. When she was asked to pay for the medical care she had received, Dabia became furious and attacked the personnel, shouting that she had never asked to be treated and therefore shouldn't have to pay. As she was being escorted out of the building, she threatened that she would come back, adding that they didn't know what she was capable of. Despite this outburst, she had no criminal record by the time she was detained in August 2022. She was no longer studying and no longer had legal residency status in France. But since she hadn't committed any offenses, she was released and given 30 days to either sort out her paperwork or leave the country. However, she did neither. She simply disappeared from the radar of official authorities. She had no job, no permanent home, and was officially listed as homeless, although in reality she had moved in with her sister. Her older sister later admitted that Dabia had clearly been showing signs of mental instability for some time. She couldn't handle rejection, and every time something didn't go her way, she would explode in anger. Still, Dabia refused any psychiatric treatment, and her sister didn't know what else she could do to help her. During questioning, Dabia confessed to the crime several times, and then took back her words. When police showed her the photographs of how Lola had been found, she said that the images made her feel neither hot nor cold, adding that she too had been abused and had watched her parents die before her eyes. She told investigators that she lured Lola into her sister's apartment, where she forced the girl to undress and take a shower. Dabia then assaulted her, tied her hands and feet, and covered her face with tape. According to the autopsy, this caused Lola to first lose consciousness and then her life. Afterward, as if nothing had happened, Dabia drank coffee and listened to music. For some unclear reason, she then cut the lifeless body, possibly with a knife or scissors. She also claimed that she tasted Lola's blood, collecting some in a small vial, although the police never found such an item. Later, Dabia suddenly retracted her confession, saying she could never do such a thing to a child and blaming the crime on a mysterious knife-wielding man. Then she changed her story again, saying she had been fighting not with Lola, but with a ghost. Finally, she returned to her first confession, and this time investigators seemed to uncover the bizarre and all the more inhuman motive behind the crime. Dabia explained that shortly before the murder she had approached Lola's mother, Delphine, who worked as the building's manager. She asked Delphine to give her an electronic keycard, a pass that would allow her to enter and leave the building whenever she pleased, without having to ask her sister to let her in. Delphine had the authority to issue such passes, but refused, since Dabia was not an official resident of the building. She was merely a guest of her sister. Dabia, who was not used to hearing no for an answer, took this refusal as a personal insult. When she later saw Delphine's daughter Lola on the street, a girl who looked exactly like her mother, her pent-up anger boiled over, and she decided to take revenge. In other words, she committed the murder simply because, at 24 years old, she was not accustomed to being denied and wanted every whim of hers to be fulfilled. Investigators believe that at some point, the attack moved from the apartment to the basement of the building, where they found clear signs of a struggle. However, certain aspects of the case still remain unclear. For example, some evidence suggests a ritualistic element, such as the numbers written on Lola's feet and Dabia's claim that she drank her blood. In any case, police firmly dismiss the theory that organ trafficking was involved. They consider these details merely further reflections of the suspect's deeply disturbed psychological state. Dabia was charged with murder, acts of violence involving torture, cruel treatment of a minor under the age of 15, and concealment of a body, crimes that together could carry a sentence of up to 30 years in prison. However, investigators initially believed she might not have acted alone. The police arrested 5 additional people. The first was Dabia's sister, since everything had taken place in her apartment and in the basement of her building. But it was soon established that she had no knowledge of what happened and wasn't home at the time of the crime. The other 3 suspects were also released shortly afterward, and their names were never made public. The situation, however, is less clear with 43-year-old Rachid, Dabia's former boyfriend, who was charged with helping to conceal the body. Dabia herself accused him of being the organizer of the murder. What raised police suspicion was his behavior toward a taxi driver who had tried to help Dabia with her suitcase. Rashid abruptly told the driver to leave her alone. Those words were enough to put him under investigation. Did he know what was inside? He insists he didn't, that he never opened the suitcase and had no idea what it contained. At this point, the main question is whether the crime was the result of Dabia's mental breakdown or a deliberate act of revenge against Delphine. If she is found to be mentally ill, she will be treated in a specialized psychiatric institution. If she is deemed competent, she will stand trial. In early December 2022, a forensic psychiatrist submitted his report to investigators. He described Dabia as a very dangerous person, but not mentally ill. In other words, while she may not be entirely stable, this does not make her insane or incapable of understanding her actions. She is fully aware that what she did was horrific, illegal, and punishable, and she must face justice. Of course, Dabia's defense attorneys are expected to request additional psychiatric evaluations to challenge these findings. Currently, the accused is being held in solitary confinement at Fresnes Prison, the second largest prison in France, located just southeast of Paris. According to media reports, she rarely goes outside for walks, prefers to watch television, and, disturbingly, is said to smile and show pride whenever she sees herself featured in the news. Since Dabia had been living in France illegally for several months prior to committing the crime, politicians seized on this story to raise questions that interested them. They were quick to claim that there is a lack of measures against illegal migration in France because many crimes committed in the country are allegedly caused by migrants. In other words, if they had deported Dabia in time, today Lola would still be going to school, practicing gymnastics and figure skating, and simply enjoying life with her parents and older brothers. But Lola's parents believe that politicians are simply using the horrific death of their daughter to score political points. Johan and Delphine themselves decided that it was unbearably hard to stay in Paris, and they moved to Pas-de-Calais, where they are originally from. October 2025, in a Paris courtroom, justice was finally served. Dabia Benkired found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. But for Lola's family, no verdict could ever heal what was lost. They left the city that once was home, searching for peace that may never come. Some stories end behind prison walls. Others stay with us forever. This was the story of Lola Daviet, a name Paris will never forget. On December 28, 2014, a teenage girl went missing in Uruguay. News of her disappearance quickly spread around the world due to the strange circumstances surrounding it. She didn't vanish late at night in a dangerous area. No, she was walking along the beach in broad daylight, in full view of everyone. Yet it seemed as if the ground opened up and simply swallowed her whole. No one saw anything, no one knew anything. And then, a few days later, her body was found in a location the police had searched multiple times before, raising even more disturbing questions. Lola Luna Chomrales was born on November 4, 1999, in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She grew up in the family of Adriana Belmonte and Diego Chomrales, the son of renowned chef Beatriz Chomrales. In November 2014, Lola turned 15, and her parents decided to give her a trip to New York for the New Year holidays. But before that, they sent her to spend a few days in Rocha, Uruguay, with her godmother's family. On December 27th, Lola arrived in Uruguay, where she was greeted by her godmother, Claudia Fernandez. The girl was clearly in a great mood, which was captured in a photo Claudia took. Claudia, her husband Hernan, and their 2 children were happy to have Lola visiting. They all planned to spend these few days together, enjoying the beach at Barra de Valisas, swimming in the sea, and relaxing. That same evening, Lola, Hernan, and his 14-year-old stepson attended a drum festival taking place in the center of town. Hernan and the boy stayed close to Lola in the crowd, but at some point the stepson drifted away because he got bored. In any case, after the festival, they all returned home together. And the next day, the family went to the beach. Around 3 p.m., Lola asked her godmother if she could take a walk along the shore. She wanted to follow a fairly popular trail leading to the Aguas Dulces Spa Resort, a route known for its scenic locale flora and fauna. Since it was considered a common and safe walking path, and the locals were known for being friendly and welcoming, Claudia agreed. She told Lola what time they would expect her back, and watched her calmly walk away down the beach. Lola was wearing a bikini and denim shorts. She had a backpack with her containing a sarong, a book, her ID, a bottle of water, and a towel. She did not bring her phone. The signal on the beach was poor anyway. Inside her bag was also a wallet with 2,000 Uruguayan pesos. Hours passed, night fell, and Lola still hadn't returned. Her godmother grew worried. The family walked the route Lola was supposed to take, but she was nowhere to be found. In the evening, Claudia called Lola's parents to explain what had happened. She told Adriana that she had already contacted the police, but in reality, it took another 45 minutes before they went to the station and officially reported the teenager missing. The police launched a search for Lola. Since she had disappeared during a walk along the beach, they combed the entire shoreline thoroughly. Helicopters and search dogs were brought in. Lola's parents immediately traveled to Uruguay to assist the police. Almost simultaneously with the start of the investigation, anonymous phone calls began coming to Adriana and Diego. The caller didn't demand ransom or make any requests. He simply claimed that Lola was with him and that she was fine. Unfortunately, this was not true. 2 days later, on December 30th, her body was found partially covered with sand on the beach. The location was an area with many dunes and dense vegetation. There were shallow knife cuts on her neck and traces of blows on her head. The autopsy revealed that Lola had been attacked from behind and then either dragged or forced to walk to the spot where she was found. There, the killer pressed her face into the sand long enough for her to suffocate, confirmed by the sand discovered inside her lungs. After the crime became known, the media in both Argentina and Uruguay erupted with intense coverage. As often happens in such cases, journalists began putting forward their own theories about what might have happened. The first suspicions of Uruguayan police and the press fell on the godmother's family, especially on Hernan. There were several reasons for this. First, they told Adriana and Diego that they had already contacted the police, even though they actually delayed almost an hour before filing the report. Second, the media tried to frame as suspicious the fact that Lola, Hernan, and his 14-year-old stepson attended the drum festival together, and at some point the boy walked away, leaving Lola alone with Hernan. There was also speculation regarding sexual assault, but the forensic examination found no evidence to support that. Still, there were additional factors fueling doubts. Claudia and Hernan immediately hired a lawyer, and no member of the family agreed to take a polygraph test. Tensions grew after Lola's parents made a series of public statements. Diego in particular said he had never fully trusted Hernan, which raised further questions. If he didn't trust the man, why did he allow his daughter to travel with them? It is important to note that Claudia and Adriana had been friends for 25 years. Hernan was Claudia's second husband, and Lola's parents had known him for about 5 years. They had all originally lived in Argentina, but Claudia and Hernan had since moved to Uruguay. When interrogated, Hernan reportedly gave contradictory statements, leading to his arrest on December 31st. Claudia was also arrested on suspicion of concealment, and her son was detained under the assumption that he might have made the anonymous calls. It was never conclusively proven that he was the caller. Most likely, the calls were a tasteless prank. In any case, police questioned all 3 family members for several days, but no evidence emerged against them. Investigators admitted that they found discrepancies in their testimonies, but nothing significant enough for charges. Hernan claimed they came home at 11 p.m., while his son said midnight. And that was the only inconsistency. With nothing solid to hold them on, all 3 were released on January 2nd, 2015. Following the public accusations and tension, the relationship between the former friends appeared to collapse. Claudia and her family never again spoke to Lola's parents, not even a phone call to offer condolences. Adriana believes this silence may have been advised by their lawyer, but she still feels that, after 25 years of friendship, Claudia could have reached out simply as a human being. A few days after the body was found, Lola's pink backpack was discovered. It had also been buried in the sand, about 200 meters from where her body had been located. This immediately raised many questions. How could the police miss both the body and the backpack, despite thoroughly searching the beach and the surrounding area multiple times? Authorities had initially insisted that the beach was a very safe area, but this was questionable, as drug dealers were known to operate there, particularly in the exact area where the body was found. Inside the backpack were almost all of Lola's belongings, except for the 2,000 Uruguayan pesos that the perpetrator had taken from her wallet. In addition, the towel and documents inside the bag were stained with blood. Forensic experts examined these items and detected Lola's DNA, but it was mixed with the DNA of a man. Since suspicion had not yet been fully lifted from Hernan, his DNA was compared to the sample. It did not match. The male DNA was also checked against the Uruguayan police database, but no match was found. After the backpack was found, the first major suspect sparked a wave of attention. He was identified based on witness statements about where he had been on the day of the murder. According to local residents, a man nicknamed El Conejo was working on a rooftop near the beach around the time Lola went for her walk. In the middle of the day, he left for lunch. and his co-workers said he had no money with him. Yet he returned with food and cash. Naturally, the question arose, where did he get the food if he didn't buy it? But that wasn't all. Someone allegedly even saw him with a pink backpack on the very day of Lola's disappearance. The police detained the man and things quickly escalated. One newspaper reported that he had confessed to the murder. Other media outlets repeated the claim, but it turned out to be untrue. The man gave an explanation for the food, and although police suspected he might have stolen it from beachgoers, there was nothing linking him to Lola's case. He never confessed to anything and later filed a lawsuit against the newspapers that had spread false information. After that, the investigation slowed significantly. The main suspects had already been released and detectives had no solid leads left to pursue. At first glance, it seemed that Lola didn't know anyone in the town, but she had gone to the drum festival in the city center, and being friendly and outgoing, she wasn't shy about talking to people, so the police had to explore that possibility. They detained and questioned around 40 individuals, mostly vendors and drug dealers from the beach, but all of them were released. The situation was further complicated by the constant turnover of prosecutors and judges. Every time a new prosecutor was assigned, they would restart the review of the case from the beginning. But on February 18, 2015, the case seemed to finally make a small step forward. Police received an anonymous phone call. The caller claimed that Angel Moreira, known by the nickname El Cachila, was involved in the crime. Police detained the man and questioned him. Angel worked on the beach, parking cars. He said he met Lola while she was walking along the shore. He approached her to offer some kind of small souvenir trinket. They exchanged a few words about where she was from, when Lola suddenly said she felt dizzy. Angel claimed he offered to take her to a shady spot. He led her to a place covered by dunes and thick bushes, where there was at least some shade and coolness. There, the girl fell to her knees. Angel said he tried to feel her pulse, and when he didn't detect one, he panicked and ran away. His statement sounded extremely strange, but with no evidence against him, the police had to release him. 4 years later, a new prosecutor on the case, Jorge Bass, reviewed the case files again and decided to question Angel once more. After the interrogation on May 22, 2019, Moreira was arrested, this time on charges of aiding and abetting the killer. His DNA did not match the DNA found on Lola's towel and documents, so the prosecutor believed he was helping to cover for the real perpetrator. Bass explained that in Angel's first statements back in 2015, he gave specific details that only someone who was with Lola during the murder could have known. For example, he knew she had fallen to her knees on the sand, something the medical examiner later confirmed. But Lola didn't fall because she suddenly felt dizzy. She fell because she had been stabbed with shallow knife wounds. And yet, despite Angel's arrest, the Chomnales family would have to wait several more years for an answer to their biggest question. While the investigation stalled, geneticist Natalia Sandberg stepped in. And 7 years after the murder, the case took a turn that now seems decisive. The way investigators finally found the suspect felt like something straight out of a detective novel. Sandberg came up with the idea to trace the genetic lineage of the unknown male DNA found on Lola's towel and documents. There were no matches along the paternal line, but when she looked at the maternal line, she found a slight connection to a prisoner serving time for murder. In other words, the man whose blood was left on Lola's belongings was related to someone already behind bars. The breakthrough came after a triple homicide that shook the region. 3 young Marines were executed with gunshots to the head at a naval facility on Cerro de Montevideo on the morning of May 31, 2020. The victims were Juan Manuel Escobar, 31, Alex Guillen, 25, Alan Rodriguez, 22. Police quickly identified the killer, Jonathan Bragundi. Jonathan was born in Rocha. When investigators located his mother and analyzed her DNA, they made a critical discovery. They were actually looking for another one of her sons, Jonathan's half-brother. The woman told police she had 11 children from different fathers, including 8 boys, and that only one of them had been put up for adoption when he was just 18 days old. And that infant, as it turned out, had grown into the man police had been searching for during all these years. Their new suspect was named Leonardo David Sena. In 2014, at the time of Lola's murder, Senna was homeless, drifting between La Paloma, Chuy, and Castillos, surviving on odd jobs. Recently, he had finally settled in the town of Chuy, lived with a girlfriend, and worked at a bakery. His record with the police stretched back to 2003. Violence, theft, aggression, but none of his offenses placed his DNA into the database, which had only been established after 2012. So on May 18, 2022, police obtained a warrant to search his home. They suspected he would refuse to voluntarily provide his DNA, and they were right. But forensic experts collected his toothbrush and hairbrush. To their shock and relief, the DNA match came back 100% positive. It was him. On May 19th, Leonardo was arrested at the border with Brazil. During interrogation, Senna denied any involvement in the murder. He claimed his DNA ended up on Lola's towel and documents because he had found her pink backpack on the beach, discovered a wallet inside with 2,000 pesos, and stole the money. As for the blood, he said he had cut his hand on a broken bottle at work earlier that day, and when he reached inside the bag, the plaster came off and the wound bled, so he wiped his hand on her towel. But his version quickly fell apart. First, his blood wasn't simply present on Lola's belongings, it was mixed with her blood. That could not have happened if he merely stole money from a found bag. Second, according to his story, someone else must have taken the backpack after he did and for no reason buried it 4 kilometers away without stealing anything from it. Even Senna couldn't convincingly defend this absurdity. And finally, his colleagues from December 2014 remembered no bottle incident or cut hand. In fact, the records showed that Senna was no longer working at the brewery on the day of the murder. According to police, this is what actually happened. On December 28, 2014, in the middle of the day, as Lola went for a walk along the beach, she was intercepted by Leonardo and Angel. They dragged her into an area filled with dunes and bushes. There, Lola tried to resist, and the kidnappers struck her multiple times on the head and slashed her neck with a knife, causing her to fall to her knees. These injuries, however, were not immediately fatal, and Lola continued to struggle. She likely screamed loudly, trying to attract the attention of other beachgoers or vendors. To force her to stop, her face was pressed into the sand. They held her down too long, which ultimately caused her to suffocate. Police are convinced that violence was the motive, though the attackers did not intend to kill her. They were not prepared for the intensity of her resistance and the struggle from the teenage girl. This theory is supported by Leonardo's criminal record. In 2009, at age 26, he committed a very similar crime. His victim was a 15-year-old girl, like Lola. Leonardo had followed her for several blocks and forced her into a remote wooded area where he committed a serious criminal act. Uruguayan police are confident that at least 2 people were involved in the attack on Lola. Leonardo was therefore charged with murder with aggravating circumstances and Angel with complicity/cover-up. Prosecutor Jorge Bass demanded a 10-year sentence for Angel and 15 to 30 years for Leonardo. In June 2021, Angel, who had been imprisoned since 2019, was released on parole. Despite psychiatric and psychological evaluations labeling him as aggressive yet impulsively uncontrollable, the judge found no grounds to convict him of aiding a criminal, since aiding someone after the crime is not the same as being an accomplice. However, the prosecutor appealed, arguing that Angel was present before, during, and after the crime. Despite their initial suspicions, Lola's parents, Adriana and Diego, trust the police evidence, agree that 2 suspects were involved, and hope for a swift and fair verdict.